In this video, we are going to continue looking at our price controls. In this video, specifically, we're going to be looking at the effects of price floors. So here we've got the list of the effects of price floors. A lot of similarities with the effects of price ceilings, but here we've got price floors are going to cause surpluses. They're going to cause a deadweight loss, just like our price ceilings did. We're also going to see wasteful increases in quality and misallocation of resources, just like we did with the price ceilings. All right, so let's go into these, all right, or look into these in a little bit more depth, starting with these surpluses. So a surplus occurs when quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. All right, so in this situation, when we have a price floor, kind of that minimum price allowed by law, then this is what we're going to see. All right, we're going to see an increase, all right, or a larger quantity supplied than quantity demanded. So let's take a look at that graphically. All right, so we've got supply and demand, and we're going to say that this is the market for labor, right? So we said that minimum wage is an example of a price floor. Now in this scenario, the supply curve, right, the producers, right, those are workers, right? They are the ones supplying their labor, right? Employers are the ones that demand labor. All right, so here we're looking at this, all right? We know that a price floor is only binding if that price floor is greater than our equilibrium price. So let's set our price floor here, all right? And we can see once we've got, actually, hold on, let's make this a different color so it's a little easier to see for everybody. All right, so here is our price floor. So this helps us see why a binding price floor is above the equilibrium price. It's in the name, it is a floor, right? If we were at a price up here, just because that's the way the market was, and then we got to this new point, the market would drive, right, the price down to equilibrium, right? But with a price floor, we're hitting the floor, we can't go any further down, right? We can't actually reach that equilibrium price. That's what makes it binding. Right, and just like with our price ceiling, we can take our price control, follow it over to the supply and demand curves, right, to find out our quantity supplied and quantity demanded. So here, where it intersects our demand curve, that's our quantity demanded. Where it intersects our supply curve, that's where we're going to find our quantity supplied. Right, and so the difference between our quantity supplied and our quantity demanded is the size of our surplus. Right, now when we're talking about the labor market, there is another name we could call our surplus. And that is unemployment. Right, so when we have a price floor, right, that price floor is going to kind of encourage people, workers, right, to try to get a job because that price is higher, or is very high, right? It's going to kind encourage more people than it would have to try to seek a job, but it's also going to reduce the quantity demanded. So for whatever, probably the big reason is that an employee or an employer just can't afford to have as many workers at that price, or might not be able to afford any workers, right? And might either have to shut down or just start doing everything themselves. All right, and so when we have a price floor, all right, that is going to lead to a surplus of whatever product. If we're looking at it from this kind of perspective of market, minimum wage, and a minimum wage is going to result in unemployment. Now, we have a whole chapter on unemployment later on in the semester, so we're going to talk more about that. But this is really just to get the idea of a price floor and look at kind of what happens when we have one of those, how we get that surplus. All right, but that's it for kind of our surplus. Now let's talk about the deadweight loss. And I'm actually just going to use the same graph because we've really already looked at our deadweight loss with the price ceilings. Is essentially the same thing. The only difference is kind of where those lines are coming from. All right, so just like with the price ceiling, right, if we were to look at this before we put our price floor in, right, we would have all of this triangle would be consumer surplus, all of this triangle would be, excuse me, did I say producer? This entire triangle up here would be consumer surplus, this would be producer surplus, right? But once we get a price ceiling, or excuse me, a price floor in, right, well now the quantity demanded is stuck here, right? And just like how quantity supplied was the lower of the two with the price ceiling, and that's the one that really mattered as far as how many units are going to be bought and sold. The same is true here, right? If nobody is demanding a product, then you can't sell it, all right? And so this quantity demanded is how much is going to be bought and sold, right? And so you can think about, all right, well, our consumer surplus is the area above the price, which is now the price floor, and the demand curve, right? And so this little triangle here in red, that is our consumer surplus. All right, and our producer surplus, as usual, is the area below the price, which is our price floor, and above the supply curve. All right, so below price, above the supply curve, right? And once again, we're going to stop here where this line gives us our quantity demanded, because there's no more being bought and sold at this point. All right, so of course that leaves this triangle right here, very, very similar looking to our price ceiling example, right? And we could calculate it just the same if we had numbers up here, right? So still a triangle, still 1/2 times base times height. All right, but we can see here, all right, we do have a deadweight loss. All right, producers are going to see their, are more likely to see their surplus increase to the detriment of consumers. That's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but this lost surplus, the surplus that we could have had in the economy as a whole, right? That is, most people would consider not a great thing, unless you're one of those producers, right? Definitely, if you're a consumer, you're not going to like that. All right, but that is what our deadweight loss is going to look like. All right, and again, if we had numbers up here, we could go ahead and do that calculation, but we're not going to worry too much about that. right now, because we've seen an example of that. Again, the process of finding that deadweight loss is exactly the same for the price ceiling as it is for the price floor. So that same process will work in both cases. All right, so now the last two, all right, and similar to quite a few of those from the price ceilings video, I'm not going to write anything down, or at least I don't plan to. I might end up realizing I want to, but so just kind of more important to write down what I'm talking about rather than the nothing I put on the board. All right, so our third effect of a price ceiling is wasteful increases in quality. All right, so what do we mean by this? All right, so I'm going to give you two examples. The first one, this kind of comes from your textbook, but during the kind of mid-20th century in the US, any airlines that flew over state lines were regulated by, I think it was the Civilian Aeronautics Board, right? And they set prices, right? They would set a price floor for airfare, right? So this meant that the airlines could not compete with each other on a basis of price, right? They couldn't say, hey, I will fly you from Denver to Atlanta for less than these other guys, because there was only so far down they could go, right? So what they did instead was they made kind of these wasteful increases in quality, right? They had bigger seats, kind of more leg room, they had more amenities, right? Meals, right? All that kind of stuff, right? Kind of think of the Mad Men era of flying on planes, where, you know, I guess really probably people wore suits partially because only people that had quite a bit of money could afford to fly on a plane. But that whole kind of flying was an experience, which some people kind of complain that we don't have that anymore. However, you know, obviously we don't want that, right? As your book puts it, you know, you would probably rather save some money, right, on the flight and not get a meal on the way to Paris, right? And be able to save that money and go spend it in a Parisian restaurant, right? We don't really, people have shown just by the way they've interacted with airlines since deregulation that we don't, you know, we'll cram ourselves in to an airplane like sardines just to get where we're going because it's extremely fast, right? And usually it's pretty, you know, well, depending on when you buy a ticket, it can be very cost effective, right? So, you know, without the price floor, right, we kind of increased that efficiency, right? We're saying, hey, you know, all this extra stuff, all these kind of all this quality you've got, we don't want that. We just want to get from one place to another, right? And so we can see that price floor caused wasteful increases in quantity or in quality, because again, as soon as those were deregulated, a lot of that stuff started going to where today, you know, there's very few amenities on any airline, right? And again, because we don't really need those, right? Second one I will offer to you, or the second example, right? Thinking about minimum wage, kind of going with minimum wage. So when you are selling your labor, right? You're selling it for a minimum wage or a salary, or a wage or a salary, I guess. And if you're working for minimum wage, then you probably, or if you've ever gotten a minimum wage job is probably a better way to start this, right? Then you probably notice some things like some requirements, like the big one, you need a high school diploma or a GED, right? Well, if you think about a lot of jobs that only, or that pay the minimum wage, I would argue probably a good number of those jobs don't really require a high school diploma to perform those jobs competently, right? But since employers are going to have so many people, right, trying to seek those positions, especially those minimum wage positions, right, they're going to find other criteria to sort out who they want, right? Again, it's another competition mechanism, right? if you are trying to get a minimum wage job and you don't have a high school diploma, right, you are going to be outcompeted by anyone that does, right? And so, but if all you're planning on doing is working minimum wage jobs, right, do you really need a high school diploma? Or is that a kind of a waste of resources, right? And if you're not interested in getting an education for any other reason, then that time might have been better served going ahead and working, right? However, again, because we do have a minimum wage, right, and so we have a surplus of people wanting those jobs, employers can kind of use those other mechanisms to kind of select through people, all right? But again, increasing that one's not as tight of an example as the airlines, but again, all right, kind of forcing everybody to do that because that's like the minimum now, right? Whereas if we had no price floor we had no minimum wage, right? You could just go and say, look, this is where I'm at, this is how much I'm willing to work for, and then that's it. All right, but that is our wasteful increases in quality. Now let's talk a little bit about misallocation of resources. So we talked about this with the price ceilings, and very similar to what we said there is what we're going to say, or what I'm going to say now, right? When we have a price control, whether it's a price ceiling or a price floor, right, that is reducing the ability of prices or just removing the ability of prices to act as a signal and an incentive, right? With a price floor, you are kind of overvaluing whatever good you're looking at, right? Because you're setting the price artificially high. So what that means is that there are resources that aren't being taken advantage of because people think they are kind of too valuable, right? Or at least they've been priced in that way. All right, so if you think about kind of the airline example, right, back when there were these regulations, right, and the price was higher, right, there were probably a lot of people that could have benefited from air travel, right, and the actual value of air travel, if it was accurately represented, right, and we didn't have that price floor, those people would have taken an airplane, right? But because the price was artificially high, right, maybe some people either didn't think that it was worth it or they couldn't afford it, whatever it was, right, and then maybe drove cross country to get somewhere, kind of wasting time, right, and other resources. So that would be an example of a misallocation of resources. If the airfare had been allowed to go to the equilibrium price, right, those people that it's worth it for them to fly would have done so at that price. But when you set that price floor, right, that's going to take some people out of wanting to get that to take an airplane, right? So again, by overstating, right, the value of air travel, right, you're going to lose some kind of efficiency. You're going to misallocate some resources. You're going to have people who should be taking airplanes, right, flying, that are not going to fly because the price has been set artificially high. All right, and you're going to have that with other resources as well, right? There are probably plenty of jobs in the U.S. that could be done cheaper with kind of actual human laborers, right? But as we have an increase in things like minimum wage, right, as labor becomes more expensive, right, companies, firms, employers are more likely to swap labor for capital, right? So instead of having humans doing the work, they're going to get machines, right? And if that minimum wage continues to rise, then more jobs that were kind of those minimum wage jobs are going to get replaced by capital, right? You might have already seen these, the little McDonald's. I don't know how many of you guys frequent McDonald's on a regular basis, but they've got the little ordering kiosks where you can just go up and it's a touch screen and you get your order. And I like it because I don't really, like talking to people, but at this point, the job of cashier at McDonald's is probably only a few years away from being obsolete, right? You can already see that even if you go in a peak time, they might only have one person kind of in that cashier position, and they're not even ringing people up. They're just kind of there to monitor, right? And kind of that job has been replaced by those machines, right? And again, and that's another thing that kind of we sometimes fail to recognize when we have things like these price floors, right? If you set the price of something too high, then people are going to find an alternative. All right, but that was supposed to be about misallocation of resources, but again, kind of the point of that was, now I remember, is that it might not be the most efficient thing to get those robots, right? It might not be the most efficient move to get those robots, but if the other side of it, right, the labor side, if that market has been distorted and so you don't actually know how valuable these are, or at least just based off of the price, the wage, you're saying, now with that, with $7.25, at $7.25 an hour, $7.25 an hour, it's going to be cheaper for me to get this computer program that's going to do the exact same thing that this employee did, right? To get this machine that did the exact same thing this employee did, all right? And if you go and do that, right, get that capital to replace the labor, then you're kind of misallocating resources, because if the wage, right, if wages were allowed to go to an equilibrium, right, you would have less unemployment, right, and you would not have this misallocation of resources. All right, but again, as far as unemployment goes, we've got a whole chapter on it, so we're going to talk about that more later. But that's it for now, and that is it for this video. I believe that is all. Yes, so those are all of the 4 effects of a price floor. In the next chapter, we're going to be looking at international trade. So I will see you then.